Alright, buckle up, because tonight we're diving into the surprisingly trippy world of ancient Egyptian recreational chemistry. We're talking about the civilization that gave us pyramids, mummies, and apparently festivals that could give your college roommates' worst decisions a serious run for their money. So before we get into it, if you're enjoying the vibe here, do me a solid and hit that like button and maybe even subscribe. It helps more than you know. And hey, I'm always curious. Drop a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is. It's awesome seeing this little global community we've got going. Okay, enough of that. Dim the lights, let's get weird with the ancient world. First up on our tour of the pharaoh's secret stash, the blue lotus flower. You've definitely seen this thing in tomb paintings. It's the elegant blue flower always being sniffed by some super important pharaoh or waved around at a banquet like an ancient Egyptian cheers. But here's the kicker. This flower wasn't just for decoration. Nope. The Egyptians knew it had some mildly psychoactive properties. That's right. The blue lotus could get you just a little bit floaty. The recipe was simple enough for even the most distracted pyramid builder to follow. You take the dried petals, dunk them in a big old jug of wine, and let them soak for a few days. Then, you drink this magical infusion at festivals, temple ceremonies, or whenever you felt like tuning out the sound of 1,000 people chanting at the top of their lungs. The result? A soft, dreamy euphoria. We're not talking forget-your-own-name levels of messed up, but just enough to make a 16-hour shift of hauling limestone blocks sound like a fun group project. Of course, the Egyptians didn't call it getting high. That would be uncivilized. They called it communing with the gods, which is by far the most respectable excuse ever invented. The flower was a huge deal in their religion, linked to rebirth and the sun god Ra, making it the perfect accessory for both temple rituals and funeral after-parties. Sniffing the flower was a symbolic way of inhaling divinity. And, okay, probably also a fantastic way to take the edge off after a long day of ruling the entire Nile Valley. This stuff was everywhere in their art. Pharaohs holding it, party guest passing it around like a floral peace pipe, and they even decorated mummies with it. The logic seemed to be, hey, if we're travelling to the afterlife for all of eternity, we'd better make sure we're stocked up. Honestly, practical. At the wilder festivals, this lotus wine made the music sound better, the dancing a lot less coordinated, and all that hieroglyphic poetry suddenly seemed way more profound. Now, if the blue lotus was the chill, relaxed party guest, our next topic is the one that shows up, flips the table, and challenges a god to a drinking contest. Welcome, my friends, to the Feast of Drunkenness. Subtle name, right? Nope. But is it accurate? Extremely. This was the ancient Egyptian equivalent of a national holiday dedicated to blacking out, in honor of not being wiped out by a vengeful god. The backstory is epic. According to the myth, the goddess Hathor once went on a bloody rampage to punish humanity that would make a disaster movie blush. The other gods, seeing that maybe she was overdoing it a little, tricked her into drinking a whole lake of red beer that looked like blood. She passed out cold, woke up in a much better mood, and just like that, humanity was saved from total annihilation by a case of divine alcohol poisoning. To celebrate this heroic hangover, Egyptians gathered once a year to get thoroughly biblically obliterated. And I mean that literally. The goal was to drink until you entered a divine trance, which sounds poetic until you realize it often meant collapsing, face first into a mud brick courtyard while strangers hiccuped praises to the gods over your unconscious body. The ritual kicked off at dawn with music, tambourines and priests cheerfully handing out drinks, with the encouragement to drink as much as your heart desires, which was less of a blessing and more of a dare. People danced in the streets and claimed to see the goddess, though whether that was Hathor or just the bottom of a clay jug is still up for debate. But this wasn't just chaos for chaos's sake. Well, mostly not. The idea was to honour the balance between destruction and joy, and to remind everyone that even a wrathful deity could be pacified with a strong enough brew. Think of it as theology meets a keg stand. And the best part? It was all officially sanctioned. No awkward conversations the next day. Getting hammered was part of your religious duty. In fact, not passing out was suspicious. Why aren't you spiritually elevated, Khnumhotep? What? Do you hate the gods or something? Scholars today call it a ritual of renewal, where people purge their fears, inhibitions, and probably their entire stomach contents in one divinely approved party. The aftermath? A pounding headache, a few regrets, maybe a new scar shaped like Anubis, but also spiritual cleansing. So who's ready for a beer? So I asked who's ready for a beer. Before you answer, let me be clear. Forget everything you know about beer. Ancient Egyptian beer wasn't golden, bubbly, or anything you'd remotely recognize. It was thick, porridge-like, and so opaque you could probably use it to patch a wall. We're talking about a viscous, beige, bread-adjacent fluid that the Egyptians cheerfully called beer, and modern brewers would call a war crime. This stuff was less of a refreshing beverage and more of a fermented soup with ambition. The recipe? You take some half-baked loaves of emmer bread, soak them in water, mash the whole thing up into a lumpy stew, and then let it ferment in open vats. The final product was cloudy, chunky, and distressingly chewable. Imagine oatmeal, if oatmeal had opinions and a mild buzz. Archaeologists generously describe its texture as rustic. So why on earth was everyone drinking this stuff? From pharaohs to peasants to literal toddlers? Simple. In a world where the water from the Nile could kill you and milk was suspicious at best, this fermented bread slurry was the safest, most reliable thing to drink. It was a food group unto itself. Liquid bread, a bowl of carbs in denial. Plus, it was calorically dense and mildly intoxicating, which are two fantastic qualities when your daily concerns include desert heat, crocodiles, and massive public works projects. And here's the kicker. It was also how people got paid. That's right. The guys hauling multi-ton limestone blocks up the side of a pyramid weren't getting a paycheck. They were getting daily beer rations, sometimes several litres a day. This means the architectural wonders of the ancient world, structures that still baffle engineers today, were built by a workforce that was constantly buzzed and breaded. Let that sink in the next time you miss a deadline with a cappuccino in your hand. Of course, they didn't just drink it straight. This is ancient Egypt after all. They had to get creative. At festivals and temple rituals, the beer would be enhanced with herbs, dates, honey, and other mystery ingredients that were either sacred or just highly experimental. Whether the addition of mandrake was intentional, or if someone was just really tired of reality is a question historians are still debating. The taste? Probably awful. But if you're living in 1300 BCE, covered in sand, and trying not to die of dysentery, a lukewarm jar of beer porridge is Michelin-star cuisine. It was served from communal jugs, with straws that had filters to catch the bigger bread chunks, because nothing says spiritual unity like 5 adults slurping from the same pot of soggy bread water. Now that you've washed down your chewable beer with a floral buzz from the Lotus, it's time to set the mood with some smoke. But not just any smoke. We're talking about kaifi, the ancient Egyptian incense that made temples smell like a divine bakery. and left everyone wondering if they were meditating or just very, very lightheaded. Kifi wasn't your simple stick of frankincense. This was the perfumed love child of an apothecary and a pastry chef. The recipes were top secret, varying from temple to temple, but the ingredient list often included myrrh, honey, wine, raisins, cinnamon, juniper, and mint. You mix it all up, let it ferment, dry it into little pellets, and then burn them in sacred spaces until everyone either felt deeply spiritual or completely forgot why they walked in the first place. It was used for ritual purification, which is ancient code for, let's fill this room with enough fragrant smoke to erase our sins, or at least our memories of last night's feast of drunkenness. And here's a fun fact. Temples didn't really have ventilation. That was considered breaking the mood. So imagine standing in a limestone cube next to a sweating priest waving a smoking dish of kifi like it's air freshener for the soul, while a chant drones on behind you. Visions weren't just encouraged, they were practically inevitable. Whether it was a divine revelation or mild asphyxiation, it didn't really matter. The gods got their tribute either way. To the Egyptians, kifi was an all-in-one spiritual elevator, medicine, and perfume. The famous Roman writer Pliny the Elder later wrote that it could cure snake bites and improve sleep, which makes a lot of sense if you assume the goal was just to pass out entirely. Some recipes were so complex they read like ancient IKEA manuals, with 16 ingredients added in precise phases under specific moons. But once lit, the aroma would drift across the Nile like a sacred fog machine, signalling that something holy was happening, or that someone was seriously overcompensating for yesterday's fish market. Even in death, kifi was part of the plan. It was burned during mummification and buried in tombs, probably responsible for at least one pharaoh being accidentally embalmed in a spice rub. In short, kifi was ancient Egypt's way of saying, if you can't drink it, burn it and breathe deeply. So, we've established that the Egyptians had their chill friend, the blue lotus, and their dramatic friend with the smoke machine, kifi. Now it's time to meet the slightly unhinged guest you invited over once and immediately regretted, mandrake. This was not your everyday garden herb. With its forked roots that vaguely resembled a tiny screaming human, and a reputation that scared even seasoned priests, mandrake was less of an herbal remedy, and more of a botanical dare. The ancient Egyptians used it in medicine as both a painkiller and a possible aphrodisiac, which is, and I cannot stress this enough, a terrifying combination. This plant earned its place in temple recipes with the kind of cautious respect usually reserved for wild crocodiles and a pharaoh in a bad mood. See, the reason for all the caution is that mandrake contains alkaloids like scopolamine and atropine. In simple terms, these are the kinds of chemical compounds that mess with your nervous system and can occasionally convince you that your bed is melting. In small, carefully measured doses, it was probably mildly relaxing. In slightly bigger ones? Welcome to a night of vivid terrors, starring the sun god Ra and a crocodile wearing a wig. And you can't talk about mandrake without mentioning the harvesting myth. According to later folklore, which likely grew from these early creepy associations, pulling a mandrake root out of the ground caused it to let out a lethal, blood-curdling scream. So, what was the logical solution? Obviously, you tie the root to a dog, cover your ears, and let the poor creature yank it free while you hope your neighbours don't ask too many questions about why your dog just passed out. While we don't have solid proof the Egyptians were tying plants to their pets, the idea that this plant had a terrifying spiritual power fits right in with their vibe. Used carefully, it could induce sleep or inspire a romantic poem. Used recklessly, you'd wake up 4 days later, convinced you were a scarab beetle. Now let's move on to something a little more mainstream, shall we say. Wedged between cures for snake bites and how to properly place an amulet on an inflamed body part, the ancient medical scrolls have a quiet little mention of Shemshemet. That's right, we're talking about cannabis. Because when it came to pain relief, the Egyptians didn't just rely on divine intervention or chewing on reeds until they forgot their problems. Sometimes they reach for the good stuff. Cannabis shows up in major medical texts like the Ebers Papyrus, mostly as a treatment for inflammation, sore eyes, and, get this, various gynecological complaints. Yes, you heard me. Ancient Egyptian women may have had access to what were essentially THC-infused suppositories, which sounds like a modern wellness trend someone is definitely going to try and resurrect on Etsy. Of course, they weren't rolling joints or baking brownies with it. At least, not that we have proof of. Cannabis was usually crushed into oils, mixed into salves, or blended with honey. Because if you're going to medicate, why not make it taste nice? Now, was it purely medicinal? Officially, yes. Unofficially, probably. Let's be real. When you're running a civilization in 120-degree heat, with limited plumbing and a deeply unpredictable crocodile problem, no one is going to blame you for accidentally over-medicating. And if your high priest starts talking to the statues a little too confidently, well, who's to say that isn't divine wisdom? Archaeologists have even found trace amounts of cannabis, along with opium and nicotine, in burial sites and on mummies, which raises some fascinating questions about their funeral offerings, and that brings us to the heavy hitter. When you've got plagues, battle wounds, and pyramid-related back injuries, sometimes even cannabis doesn't cut it. That's when you turn to the temple's top-shelf secret, the opium stash. The small, wrinkled poppy pods weren't native to Egypt. They were imported from the eastern Mediterranean, like a divine secret brought in by traders. And the Egyptians were enthusiastic early adopters. By the time of the New Kingdom, opium was well on its way to becoming the ancient world's go-to sedative. This stuff was a medical miracle. It didn't just dull pain. It smoothed over childbirth, calmed coughs, soothed angry intestines, and made those long temple chants about cosmic balance feel like they actually had a decent beat. It was administered in drinks, pills, or, because of course, suppositories, becoming the ancient pharmaceutical equivalent of saying, "Shh, don't worry about it." The priests, who were also the doctors, probably handed it out while saying things like, "This will ease the divine tension in your spleen." Whether your god was angry or your bowels were, opium could calm them both down. The ancient texts don't call it opium, of course. That would be too easy. They just vaguely reference extracts from the poppy plant, in the same way modern food labels say natural flavors, which is never comforting. But let's not pretend this was all strictly for medicine. There's always a blurry line between spiritual elevation and a really good nap. And what better way to face the underworld than to be totally blissed out and blissfully unaware of the scarab beetle crawling across your nose? Alright, so we've covered the plants, the powders and the smokes. But what happens when you want to get spiritual but you're also thirsty? You turn to wine. In ancient Egypt, wine was a sign of sophistication, a drink for the gods and a toast to Osiris. But don't let the elegant amphorae fool you. This stuff could hit like a chariot accident, especially when it came laced with the ancient equivalent of a little something extra. Egyptian wines weren't just fermented grape juice. They were infusions, concoctions, and mild experiments in altered consciousness. They flavoured their wine with everything from mandrake and blue lotus to myrrh and frankincense. These are ingredients that sound deeply spiritual until you realise they were probably added for maximum mood enhancement. Religious festivals were naturally the main stage for these potent potables. At the Feast of Drunkenness we talked about, people weren't sipping wine to appreciate its terroir. They were chugging it to achieve metaphysical disconnection. The goal wasn't to get tipsy, it was to teeter between dimensions, possibly while dancing with a priest in a leopard skin. These spiked brews were often described in medical texts as remedies, which is how you knew things were getting creative. Got a headache? Try a wine infused with fermented lotus. Existential dread. Well, that one needed priestly supervision, and probably a floor mat. And it wasn't just mortals enjoying this liquid therapy. The gods themselves were believed to appreciate a good spiked offering. Vats of wine were ritually poured out in temples, or left in tombs to help the divine descend into statues, or at least wobble in their general direction. So, if the room started spinning, it was spiritual. If you passed out in the lotus garden, that was just divine communion. For the ancient Egyptians, wine wasn't just a beverage. It was a vehicle, one that could take you to enlightenment, to sleep, or directly into the arms of a very confused crocodile god. You didn't always need a chemical boost to connect with the divine. For a civilization obsessed with order and geometry, the Egyptians were surprisingly open-minded about good old-fashioned trance states. These altered mental states were seen as direct channels to the gods, or at least to a deeply theatrical inner monologue. Divine possession wasn't treated as a medical emergency. It was treated like a religious promotion. If a temple dancer started convulsing mid-ritual, she wasn't rushed out by worried acolytes. She was applauded. Hathor had arrived, apparently, and she had some strong opinions about the tambourine tempo. These trances were often achieved through a time-honoured combination of repetitive drumming, rhythmic chanting, inhaling a roomful of kifi smoke, sleep deprivation, and of course, wine with mysterious floaties in it. The result? Sudden bouts of prophecy, dramatic gasping, and the occasional unplanned floor nap. Priests and priestesses were trained to host gods like they were Airbnb guests, welcoming them into their bodies during rituals. This might include a sudden change in voice, posture, and an overwhelming urge to announce cryptic things while staring into a fire. To outsiders, it might have looked like a mass fainting spell, but within the temple, this was how messages from the gods were delivered. Sometimes the gods advised, sometimes they scolded, and sometimes they demanded more cake offerings, which says a lot about ancient theology and ancient appetites. Now, after communing with the gods, what about catching up with family, even the ones who are, dead? In ancient Egypt, the line between the living and the dead was more of soft suggestion. Egyptians didn't just respect the dead, they actively included them in their social plans. I'm not being metaphorical. During festivals like the beautiful Feast of the Valley, families would visit the tombs of their ancestors, lugging baskets of food, jugs of beer, and the general vibe of a tailgate party, if the tailgate was parked in a necropolis. They'd sit outside the tomb, eat, drink, and commune with the deceased, which usually meant talking to a wall and hoping Grandma appreciated the pickled fish. Many tombs even had false doors, which were carved portals through which the spirits of the dead could receive the offerings. These gatherings were mutually beneficial transactions. The living fed the dead, and the dead, in theory, blessed the living in return with good crops, protection from harm, and fewer nightmares involving hippos. Everyone won. Some people even slept overnight in the tombs, hoping for dream visions from their departed loved ones, or maybe just some unsolicited financial advice from a former accountant turned ghost. To modern sensibilities, this might sound a bit macabre. But to the Egyptians, it was completely logical. The afterlife wasn't a goodbye, it was just a new address. And if Great Uncle Horotep wanted to attend the party via divine osmosis through a stone wall, who were they to say no? So, after all the incense, holy trances, and sanctioned debauchery, you might think there's a price to pay. And you'd be right. It usually arrived sometime around sunrise with a pounding headache and the vague memory of yelling at a statue. Yes, even in a world where Blue Lotus was medicine and beer was breakfast, the morning after hit just as hard. The ancient texts are suspiciously quiet on the subject of hangovers, probably because no one was in the mood to chisel hieroglyphs when their head felt like it had been personally smited by Ra. But we have some clues. Medical papyri describe pains of the head and recommend treatments involving herbs, honey, and sometimes just lying very, very still while pretending to commune with the gods. For the really bad cases, a priest might recommend a ritual cleansing, which usually involved a bucket of cold Nile water and a stern lecture on moderation that no one remembered hearing. But the real trick was plausible deniability. If you danced shirtless in the temple courtyard or passed out in a tomb alcove, you didn't say, "I overdid it." No, you said, "I was overcome by the divine." It wasn't a blackout. It was a mystical encounter with Hathor's laughter. Much more respectable. And this brings us to a key point. You'd think death would be enough to stop someone from getting invited to a party. Not in ancient Egypt. If you thought the partying stopped after your heart was weighed against a feather, think again. It just moved underground. Tombs weren't silent, solemn places. They were carefully curated starter homes for the soul, complete with food, booze, and mood-enhancing herbal arrangements. When ancient Egyptians prepared for death, they didn't just pack linens, they packed snacks, drugs, and a backup stash in case eternity got boring. When Howard Carter cracked open Tutankhamun's tomb, he didn't just find golden furniture. He found wine, oils, herbs, and what can only be described as the ancient Egyptian version of a wellness kit. If a modern influencer were buried today, it would look disturbingly similar, minus the canopic jars. This wasn't just for luxury, it was strategic. The soul needed nourishment in the afterlife. So, priests made sure you were entombed with all your spiritual comfort items, from sacred perfumes to a generous dose of whatever got you through long temple ceremonies. After all, it's hard to toast Osiris with a closed jaw. This tells us one very clear thing. The ancient Egyptians did not separate pleasure from piety. So who was running this whole operation? Who had the keys to the sacred stash and the divine medicine cabinet? Officially, the pharaoh, the earthly embodiment of Horus, was in charge. Unofficially, it was the priests. The religious elite weren't just spiritual guides. They were state-sanctioned pharmacists, supplying the population with everything from calming ointments to full-blown psychedelic experiences disguised as Holy Communion. The temples weren't just places of worship. They were massive centers of drug production. Blue Lotus didn't grow itself. Someone had to harvest it, dry it, and whisper sacred verses to it. So yes, religion was very holy, but it was also a well-oiled machine that ran on faith, herbs, and mind-altering doses of divine inspiration. In many ways, the real question of who ruled Egypt was less about crowns and more about who controlled the incense burners. And make no mistake, ancient Egyptian society was a strict hierarchy, and mind-altering substances followed the same rules. While commoners got their chewy barley beer, and maybe a whiff of temple incense if they stood close enough, the elite were sipping spiked pomegranate wine out of gold-rimmed chalices. The most potent substances, mandrake, opium, imported cannabis resins, were likely restricted to the upper echelons. For the pharaoh himself, this wasn't indulgence, it was national security. If your dreams are considered state messages from the gods, then ensuring a good night's sleep with a psychoactive nightcap is just part of the job. Meanwhile, the lower classes had to settle for the watered-down versions and whatever passed for spiritual euphoria during an 18-hour shift building obelisks. Divine enlightenment was available, but only if you could afford the luxury tomb package with the optional afterlife minibar. So, after our deep dive into sacred snorting, divine day drinking, and hallucinogenic healthcare, what does this all really say about ancient Egypt? Well, for starters, it tells us they were absolute geniuses at blending science, spirituality, and recreational chemistry into a single, cohesive belief system. Pain relief and prophecy came from the same flower. Medicine and mysticism walked hand in hand, usually to the beat of a drum and the smell of something smouldering that is definitely not FDA approved. It also shows us they had a huge amount of respect for altered states of consciousness. They didn't see it as simple escapism, but as a legitimate way to access insight, healing, and the occasional god with an animal head and a flair for drama. Their rituals weren't just for show, they were controlled chemical theatre. And of course, let's not forget the strict gatekeeping of these sacred substances. The elite had their blue Lotus spas and imported opium, while everyone else got lukewarm beer and an eye infection. It was basically the ancient version of putting wellness behind a paywall. But maybe the most revealing takeaway is this. Humans have always wanted to feel more, see more, and know more, especially if it involves lying down in a temple and not doing chores. The ancient Egyptians weren't that different from us. They just wore more eyeliner and took their hallucinations a lot more seriously. Alright, let's pack our bags, leave the sands of the Nile behind, and jump forward a few thousand years. We're heading to the late 1400s, to a place bursting with art, intellect and political intrigue, Florence, Italy. The air here is thick with incense sweat and a very specific kind of madness, the obsession with beauty, and not just any beauty, Renaissance beauty, the kind that meant looking like a flawless porcelain statue even if it literally killed you. Let's start with the foundation of this look, cerussa. This was a luxurious silky white face paint made from, and you might want to sit down for this lead. Yes, actual lead. Women all across Florence and Venice would smear this shimmering poison across their faces, necks and chests to get that ultra-pale, ethereal glow. Why? Because in a world where a tan meant you were a peasant who actually worked for a living, looking like a walking cadaver was the ultimate status symbol. And this wasn't just a light dusting of powder. No, cerussa was layered on like Venetian stucco. Some women even slept in it, letting the toxic compound soak directly into their skin for days on end. The initial result was a radiant, ghostly complexion. The long-term result, sores, skin decay, and eventually systemic lead poisoning. But did that stop them? Of course not. When the sores appeared, they just applied more lead to cover them up. Think of it as a Renaissance band-aid, one that guaranteed the wound would never ever heal. And if the lead somehow didn't get you, the mercury might. Used to treat blemishes and fade sunspots, mercury was another charming ingredient in the Renaissance beauty toolkit. Combine that with arsenic-based tonics and face baths made of vinegar, and you had a full-blown chemical warfare routine that was marketed as high fashion. It was a divine look that came at a truly divine cost. So, we've established that the first step to achieving peak Renaissance beauty was to slather your face in a shimmering cocktail of lead, mercury, and arsenic. A chemical warfare routine marketed as high fashion. But oh, we're just getting started. Once you've successfully poisoned your skin into a ghostly, corpse-like pallor, it's time for the next, equally logical step: strategic subtraction. And that starts with your hair. If you had a normal, functioning pair of eyebrows in Renaissance Florence, you clearly weren't trying hard enough. In the never-ending quest to resemble a Botticelli painting or a particularly fashionable egg, Renaissance women plucked their hairlines and eyebrows into absolute oblivion. The look of the day was a high, rounded forehead. The logic was simple. The higher your forehead, the more noble and intelligent you appeared. So, women could sit for hours, willingly yanking out entire rows of hair from their brows and, yes, their hairlines, using tweezers, rough cloth, or even seashells. This wasn't a one-and-done deal. It was constant, painful maintenance. And for any stubborn hairs that dared to grow back, the solutions were creative. Women would rub on concoctions made from walnut oil or, and I promise I am not making this up, cat dung to thin the regrowth. Some even resorted to scorching stray hairs off with a candle flame, because nothing says grace and refinement like literally lighting your face on fire. A truly sophisticated woman had no visible brows at all. Maybe a soft shadow was painted on later, with burnt cork or charcoal, which sounds elegant until you realise it would smear terribly in the Florentine heat. Imagine your eyebrows slowly dripping down your cheeks during Sunday Mass. Divine. The true irony in all of this: most of this high-stakes facial sculpting was done without mirrors. That's right. Mirrors were rare, expensive, and often distorted your reflection anyway. So this entire procedure was done by feel, or with the help of a servant. You had to have absolute trust in your maid's steady hands and complete lack of passive aggression. One wrong move from a disgruntled servant and your elegant widow's peak could easily become a monk's tonsure. Renaissance beauty was less about natural charm and more about removing your hairline, your brows, and all common sense. Once the face had been thoroughly powdered, plucked, and poisoned, it was time to move on to the body. Specifically, squeezing it into a shape the human rib cage had absolutely no business aspiring to. Say hello to the Renaissance corset. Part fashion statement, part orthopedic trauma device. Now, these weren't quite the wasp-waisted death traps of the Victorian era, but they still meant business. Known as stays or bodies, these early versions were designed to flatten the torso, not cinch it at the waist. The goal was to create a smooth, rigid, conical canvas that emphasized the bust and elongated the silhouette. Because what's sexier than looking like a very elegant plank? These stays were stiffened with whalebone if you were rich, or reeds and pasteboard if you weren't. Getting into one required a servant, a good deal of determination, and a surprising tolerance for losing your peripheral vision. A fully dressed noblewoman was essentially an armoured artichoke, layered, spiked, and strangely delicate. But corsets weren't just about looks, they were moral statements. A straight, upright posture was seen as a sign of inner virtue and good breeding. Slouching, on the other hand, suggested you were morally lazy and possibly possessed by a demon. So, if you were a well-bred lady, you stood straight, you walked stiffly, and you breathed in short, shallow gasps. Bonus points if you fainted gracefully in public. That just meant you were doing it right, and your piety was literally breathtaking. Of course, this leads to the next great Renaissance paradox. how to feast like royalty while your internal organs are basically being rearranged into new and exciting configurations. Beauty in Renaissance Italy extended all the way to the dinner table, where fashion and food had a very uneasy relationship. On one hand, you were expected to attend lavish, multi-course banquets that could last for hours. The tables would be groaning under the weight of roasted peacocks, gilded fruit, and marzipan sculptures. On the other hand, you had to do all this while being squeezed into a corset so tight that taking a deep breath was a distant, beautiful memory. Actually eating was a delicate performance. You could nibble, you could sip, but you absolutely could not unhinge your jaw and go to town on a goose leg. That would have been barbaric and also physically dangerous given the whalebone in your bodice. So you took dainty bites, kept your back ramrod straight, and smiled pleasantly through the growing pressure in your ribs. Frankly, the act of just sitting upright for hours and pretending to enjoy cold eel pie was often enough to trigger a fainting spell, which only added to the aesthetic of being a delicate, ethereal creature. This polite self-starvation had its limits, of course. Many noble women were secretly ravenous by the time they got back to their private chambers, where they could finally unlace the corset and devour a hidden stash of sweetmeats and cheese. Yes, even Renaissance beauty queens had secret, shame-filled midnight snacks, and there were even rules about what you could eat. Certain foods were believed to affect your complexion. Cucumbers? Discouraged. They made the skin look watery. Wine? Encouraged, as it flushed the cheeks with a healthy, natural colour. And in a world where your stomach had literally nowhere to expand, women had to pace their eating carefully to avoid indigestion or, God forbid, a very unladylike burp. The horror. So while the men at the table got to recline, drink heavily, and loudly argue about Dante, the women mastered the art of elegant restraint, eating just enough to seem sociable, but never enough to ruin the perfect, plank-like line of their gown. All right, so our Renaissance noblewoman has a face powdered with poison, a hairline plucked into next week, and a rib cage currently negotiating terms of surrender with a whalebone corset. She has successfully survived a 7-course banquet by eating approximately 1 grape and a crumb of marzipan. But the performance is not over. Not even close. Now that the face is a perfect ghostly mask and the body is shaped like an elegant plank, it's time to appeal to the next sense. It's time to smell expensive. Perfume. The social weapon. In Renaissance Florence, your scent wasn't just a finishing touch, it was a social weapon. A noblewoman's fragrance was as carefully curated as her family tree, and failing to smell like imported luxury was basically a public scandal. You have to understand, the streets were an olfactory nightmare. They reeked of garbage, goat, unwashed bodies, and a general sense of existential dread. But the elite? Oh, they wafted through salons and basilicas trailing clouds of rose water, musk and exotic spices. If you walked past a duchess and didn't feel mildly intoxicated by her perfume, it meant she simply wasn't trying hard enough. Perfume was big business, and Italy was the hub for distillation. But the most coveted ingredients were imported from the farthest corners of the known world. We're talking frankincense from Arabia, myrrh from Ethiopia, and cinnamon from Sri Lanka. And then there was the superstar ingredient, ambergris. This was a waxy, oddly pleasant-smelling substance that comes from the intestines of sperm whales. It was outrageously expensive and wildly fashionable. So yes, the height of elegance was essentially dabbing yourself with designer whale bath. These perfumes weren't just dabbed on the wrist. They were soaked into leather gloves, stitched into the linings of dresses, and sprayed onto handkerchiefs. that a lady would flutter dramatically whenever someone less hygienic came a little too close, which was constantly. Perfume wasn't a luxury, it was a suit of aromatic armour. Scent layering was essential for the truly ambitious beauty. It started with a scented bath of rosewater or camphor. Then came a dusting of powdered violet petals, followed by a scented oil rubbed into the temples, and finally, a heavy mist of whatever concoction your personal apothecary swore would make men weep and your rivals faint with envy. Many also wore pomanders, which were delicate, perforated orbs filled with aromatic herbs, worn around the neck or dangling from the waist like an olfactory warning bell that screamed, "Approach with caution, I smell of cinnamon and judgment." Of course, these potions weren't always benign. Some perfumes contained turpentine or tinctures so strong they could trigger headaches or fainting spells. But get the blend right, and a woman who smelled divine had real power. The power to entice, to distract, or to simply survive a crowded room of unwashed poets. Fashion, the armour of wealth. If perfume was a social weapon, then fashion was the full suit of armour, and Florence was its glittering war zone. The fabric you wore didn't just say something about you, it screamed your family's wealth, your husband's rank, and whether or not you had any shame in bankrupting him for a particularly fabulous sleeve. Velvet was the crown jewel of fabrics, imported, thick, heavy, and absurdly expensive. Wearing a heavy velvet gown in the middle of a Florentine summer? That was a true power move. It said, "Yes, I am suffering from heat stroke, but I am also extremely important." Then there was brocade, which took things a step further by weaving in patterns with gold thread. We're not talking subtle little flowers here. We're talking gowns with entire religious scenes, or roaring lions woven into them. Gowns that could double as altarpieces. The more intricate the design, the more smugly you could nod at other women's inferior dresses. And let's talk about sleeves. Sleeves were detachable, a practical feature that quickly turned into a competitive blood sport. Wealthy women owned entire wardrobes of just sleeves to mix and match with their gowns, flaunting them like today's designer handbags. There were puffed sleeves, slashed sleeves, embroidered sleeves, and sleeves so encrusted with pearls they probably needed their own servants to carry them. Colours were also a battlefield. Deep blues and vibrant crimsons were made with rare and incredibly expensive dyes, like lapis lazuli. These pigments were so costly they were locked away like treasure. Only the wealthiest could afford these hues, and the government even tried, and mostly failed, to pass laws restricting certain colours to the nobility. But who cares about laws when your dress is this fabulous? A single one of these gowns could cost more than a skilled craftsman's entire annual salary. And yet, a noblewoman didn't just want these gowns, she needed them. Every social event was a stage, and wearing the same outfit twice was social suicide. Footwear. The absurdity of elegance. Renaissance fashion didn't stop at the ankle, though to be fair, no one was ever really supposed to see your ankles. Modesty dictated that a woman's feet be kept hidden, which was a real pity, considering how completely and utterly ridiculous Renaissance footwear often was. Let's start with the most theatrical shoe ever invented, the chopine. Chopines were essentially high platform soles, like ancient Roman sandals crossed with a pair of stilts. Originally invented in Venice to keep a lady's fine dress above the muddy, plague-infested streets, they quickly became a fashion statement. And as with all fashion, they got taller and taller. Some chopines were over 20 inches high. No, that is not a typo. 20 inches. Wearing these required the balance of a tightrope walker, years of training, and most importantly a servant on each arm just to stay upright. Walking unaided was considered a social risk because if you fell, you didn't just lose your dignity, you might take out half the wedding party with you. In Florence, the trend was a bit less extreme, but wealthy women still wore delicate pointed slippers made of velvet and lined with fur, strictly for indoors, of course. To go outside, you would strap on pattens, which were wooden or cork platforms underneath your slippers to protect them from the street filth. A practical solution, unless you tripped on a cobblestone and shattered your kneecaps. The pressure to have dainty, narrow feet was immense. Shoes were pointed, narrow, and absolutely not built for actual walking. But who needed to walk when you could glide from your sedan chair to the palace hall, leaving a trail of crushed flower petals and broken arches? It all reinforced a single powerful message. Real ladies didn't walk. They floated, they glided, they suffered gracefully, and always in style. All right, so our noblewoman has been powdered, plucked, laced, perfumed, stuffed, and platformed. What could possibly come next after all that? That's right, dancing. Because nothing completes the Renaissance beauty ritual like trying to glide across a polished marble floor in 20 pounds of fabric with about 2 inches of breathable lung space. Courtly dances were serious business. These weren't your carefree, spinning in a field type of dances. No, Renaissance court dances were slow, elegant, and excruciatingly choreographed. Every single step was rehearsed. Every movement was symbolic. The wrong foot placement could imply you were socially inept. A misstep was scandalous. You might as well have shouted, "I own nothing," and run barefoot into the Arno River. For the noblewomen, dancing was the ultimate test of composure. The most popular dances, like the pavan or the galliard, required gliding in precise geometric patterns, all while keeping your gaze modestly lowered and never, under any circumstance, breathing through your mouth. That was considered undignified, which is deeply unfortunate because, as we've established, corsets did not allow for deep breaths. Every leap in a galliard was a calculated gamble against passing out cold on the marble floor. And yet, it was absolutely crucial. A woman's grace on the dance floor was as vital to her reputation as her dowry. Parents hired dance tutors the way modern influencers hire lighting designers. You learned how to turn, how to bow, and how to fan yourself just enough to be mysterious but not so much that you looked sweaty. The goal was to radiate effortless control, even as your pointed shoes blistered your feet and your ribs sent you pleading messages for oxygen. This was also the designated time for social strategy. Dancing offered some of the only rare opportunities to interact briefly with eligible men. Gloved hands might touch for a fleeting moment, eyes might meet during a bow, perfumes would mingle in the air. It was flirtation with footnotes. But you had to be careful, say too much, move too boldly, or heaven forbid, actually laugh out loud and you risk shattering your entire aesthetic of pious elegance. All the while, the background noise of the event was a choir of judgment. Other women critiqued your gown, your hairstyle, your posture. A clumsy turn or an off-rhythm curtsy could haunt your social standing for weeks. So you danced, you smiled, you endured, and when the music finally stopped, you'd excuse yourself to go repowder your sweat-streaked lead face paint before round 2 began. But eventually, even the longest nights must end. The guests have departed, the candles have melted into waxy puddles, and our Renaissance noblewoman, divine, dazzling, and delicately dying inside, finally makes it back to her private chambers. But sleep? Oh, not yet. First comes the Renaissance version of the nighttime skincare routine. Spoiler alert, it was less self-care and more controlled deterioration. Step 1. the unmasking. Out came the linen cloths, the rose water, and sometimes raw egg whites. The lead-based Sarusa had to be gently, carefully removed. Not because it was delicate, but because scrubbing too hard would take chunks of your actual skin off with it. Many women used a mix of almond oil and vinegar to lift the layers, all the while praying that their complexion underneath wasn't too ravaged. Spoiler, it usually was. Step 2. The hair, or what was left of it. Carefully, the pins, the pads, and the fake braids made of a horsehair were uncoiled. Any adhesives used to keep those high forehead wigs in place had to be dissolved with herbal tonics. All the while, you'd be hoping the cat dung and quicklime you'd used for hair removal earlier in the week hadn't left permanent bald patches. No pressure. Step 3. The Great Unlacing. This was a spiritual experience. The moment the laces of the corset were loosened was a moment of pure, unadulterated bliss. It usually involved a lot of gasping, groaning, and possibly an audible crunch as your ribcage cautiously returned to its original shape. Women could finally breathe again. Not deeply, but enough to sigh in relief and maybe whisper never again for the 100th time. Step 4. The feet. The feet were peeled out of their velvet slippers, revealing the crushed remains of what used to be toes. If you were lucky, your servant would bring a basin of warm water with lavender or rosemary to soak them in. If not, you just stared at your feet and wondered if you'd ever feel joy again.